Ariel Zirulnick is an audience and product consultant who helps newsrooms produce journalism with and for their communities and build the systems to make that work sustainable. She's also an instructor and coach with the News Product Alliance and a sustainability analyst with Lion Publishers. Ariel previously worked at LAist as the director of news experimentation. Before that, she ran the Membership Puzzle Project's Membership and News Fund and published the Membership Guide. My first question for Ariel was right in her wheelhouse.
What does product mean for a journalism outlet?
Yeah, I think for a journalism outlet, a product is anything that a news organization makes to solve a problem or meet a need for their audience members. Ideally, it serves a well-defined audience. You know broadly like who this audience is and what they're coming to you for. And usually a product is pegged to a specific way to earn revenue or a sort of downstream revenue effect, like growing your audience in a particular place. So it's a thing you make that serves a specific need and it serves a specific organizational goal.
And then what are just examples?
Yeah, I think it can be a lot of different things. And one of the big parts of my job is applying sort of product methodologies, product thinking to things that you don't typically think of as a new product. But a news product could be a newsletter. I think that's the thing people think of most often when they think of a news product. But also your homepage is a product. An event series that you launch is a product. A new sort of format or feature that you pilot is a product. We think of our voter guides as a product. A lot of the things that newsrooms make are products and can be sort of better. You can iterate on them to make them stronger products.
And so you're calling them products, or we're focused on them as products because there is a process that a lot of companies, even outside, obviously outside of journalism, use to define and scope and then test and then, iterate products. Is that why we're talking about it in this context?
Exactly. Yeah, I think product thinking, which comes from outside news, really encourages a much greater intentionality when you think about what you're building, what you're making, and how you might be adjusting it over time. So it really is in many ways about the sort of the product process as much as the thing that you're making.
All right. So somebody out there is listening right now and they say, oh, okay, I do products. I want to do a product. I need to do a new product, or I need to, make my current product better. You have your three things for this podcast that we kind of talked about before. Your first one is the desirability, feasibility, viability of the product. So go for it. What does that mean?
Sure. So usually when an organization is launching a new product or trying to improve an existing product, they're doing it because they're trying to sort of innovate on their mission, on the way of serving their audience. And when you talk about innovation, very often people think about what's called the Venn diagram for innovation. And it's sort of working at the intersection of that desirability, feasibility, and viability that Todd just mentioned. But too often newsrooms don't actually consider all three of these things before jumping into something or making key decisions. What I've experienced most often, not necessarily in my newsroom only, but I worked with many, many newsrooms in a prior role, the Membership Puzzle Project. And just so often newsrooms only thought about feasibility when they jumped into something. And feasibility is, can we do this? Do we have the tech stack? Do we have the skills? Do we have the bandwidth? And very often if an organization could say yes to that feasibility question, they go ahead and do the thing. And they never end up circling back to those other two questions, which in the end are much bigger determinants of success. Is this desirable to somebody? And is this viable? Can we support this? Just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do something. And I think that's actually like a core point of bringing product thinking to journalism is just because you can doesn't mean you should, doesn't meet a need. Can you figure out a way to monetize it or have it serve one of your other sort of organizational sustainability goals? Desirability is all about whether there's an audience need for the thing that you're making. It sounds really obvious. Why would you make something that audience members don't want? But so many newsroom decisions are still based on things like, this is important. What do we mean by important? This is part of our mission. But isn't your mission serving your audience members' needs? Or maybe they're doing it just because someone high up in the organization had this idea and nobody felt comfortable pushing back and saying, why are we doing this? What does the data tell us in terms of whether audience members actually need this?
And one thing that makes me think of is when people say, we need to do video. or something, you know, and it's like, you're just,
Right.
I think that's even further away from the idea of, well, we need to get the news out there, or we need to do the voter guide. It's like, well, just even picking a medium and saying we need to be in that medium means you're not really looking at some of these other things, right?
Yeah, I mean, the platform is the secondary decision. The first decision is, what are we making, and what in our data shows that people need the thing that we're making. And then I think you make the platform decision. Or maybe you say, we want to make a foray into video, but that shouldn't be the stopping point. Like, what types of things do people turn to video for? What times of day do they tend to engage in video? We're talking short form video, we're talking long form video. You need to sort of understand what mindset people are in, or what information they're seeking to have success at video or reels or newsletters or whatever it might be. Just simply repackaging the same thing you've always made isn't going to sort of get you there.
So doing it, I mean, just kind of quickly, how do you figure out if something's desirable?
Data, audience research. I mean, very often, I think when newsrooms don't know how to proceed, they increasingly decide to do a survey. And it's like, we don't know what to do, so let's do a survey. But that's not the right genesis for figuring out this sort of desirability question. I think you need to get really clear about, what is your audience challenge? What do you need to understand about your audience members in order to proceed? And then design the survey after that. But often, if you get really clear about that audience challenge and what information you're lacking, you might realize that you actually have the answer in your data. So my sort of process is, what's our question? What information do we need in order to make a decision about this product, about the strategy, whatever the sort of decision at hand is? And then let's see what the data says. And then if the data doesn't tell us enough, then we can do that survey to sort of either ask that question for the first time, or understand sort of the underlying things behind what we're seeing in the data. I think very often newsrooms skip over that data step and then end up asking about a whole bunch of things that they could have answered just as easily in their data, or actually the data is better at telling them, because people aren't always great at representing their behaviors when you ask like open-ended questions. How often do you do this thing, or what do you like about this thing?
Now, is a certain amount of the assumption there that you would, launch some sort of minimal viable product and then test to see what that data is, or do you actually find it in data that you've got before you even start a product?
I think it could go both ways, and it kind of depends on the timeline that you're working on and things like that. So, I mean, ideally, you get an opportunity to create an MVP and put it out in front of people, either out in front of a focus group, or sort of start putting it out there in front of audience members and building on it over time. There are a variety of reasons why a newsroom might not have the opportunity to sort of put the MVP out there and has to put out a much more like fully fleshed out and developed product. Sometimes that's tied to grant funding or a particular news moment or things like that. But that doesn't mean that the product is like is done changing. I think you can always change something once it's out there. You might notice that nobody's clicking on a certain section of a newsletter, or you might do your initial event in an event series and like nobody shows up. And so you make changes to it. And I think that's where product thinking becomes really valuable. In newsrooms, historically, we sort of put the thing out there and then it was done. Right. And now we can put the thing out there and continue tweaking it over time until it's until you can see in the audience behaviors, whether that's list growth or donations or subscriptions or low churn or whatever sort of metrics you're looking at. You can sort of tinker with the thing until it's meeting those goals. And I think that actually kind of gets to the third part of that trifecta, viability. Can we afford to do this? Do we have the capacity, and can we keep doing it? And I think for a product to be sustainable for your organization, it also has to help you meet one of your goals. And if you're really clear about your goals, it's much easier to ask that question. Is this doing for us yet what we need it to do? And if it isn't, we need to keep tinkering. We need to keep looking at the data. Maybe we need to do a survey amongst the people who are currently signed up for this thing to find out what's really working about it and what's not. But having that sort of clarity about what the product needs to do for you is the third part of the sort of innovation puzzle that very often gets forgotten, but it's really the only way to maintain a product long term.
So you've got, and your number 2 of your 3 things is defining the goal for your product. Is that where you're going with this right now?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, we're all trying to do a lot with very limited resources. We're all trying to punch above our weight in service to our communities, and we just can't afford to do things that aren't desirable and aren't viable. And like knowing whether a thing is viable really starts with sort of defining the goals for the product, but that is easier said than done, because different products have different goals, and it can be a really sort of complex puzzle to figure out what products are helping us reach new audiences, what products are helping us deepen the relationship with the audiences that we already have, which products are helpful at sort of developing that financial support from audience members. It When you're having to look at the entire sort of product stack, it can be hard to sort of keep straight which of these products are supposed to do which things for you. But it's really important to have clarity on that, because this is what helps you sort of evaluate the trade-offs. Launching any product or improving on an existing product comes with so many trade-offs. What comes first, second, and third in this newsletter? How do we market this event? What venue do we choose for this event? What comes first when you're designing a voter guide? What's at the top and what's at the bottom? All of these are prioritization questions. And it's really hard to prioritize effectively and to prioritize as a team effectively if you're not all on the same page about what the product is supposed to do for you. And, for example, at LAS, we launched a newsletter during the primary election for the post-election period. It ran just for about 2.5 weeks. And the goal was to create something that was complementary to our voter guide, which reaches hundreds of thousands of people. But most of those are what I call like election-only audience members. They come to us when they need help voting, and then they don't come back to us again until they need help voting again in 2 years. But we need to figure out a way to capture at least a slice of that audience and get to know them and figure out who they are and what's valuable about the voter guide for them. And so we created this post-election newsletter product to help people sort of stay on top of the election results and understand what the results mean for their life in LA. And it was designed to be a complete inbox experience. You could read the newsletter and never click through and still walk away like fully understanding the topic. And that was intentional. We knew that people were coming in through the voter guide or through the results page. And so driving them back to those things in order to get the information that they need would be a really frustrating loop for them. And our goal was to build the biggest newsletter audience that we could, and to kind of get in front of them with membership asks, because they'd be grateful for the help voting. The very first question that came up. Oh, yeah.
No, go ahead.
The very first question that came up when we did the retro on it was, if we have these monthly active user goals, why didn't we optimize for click-through? It's a great question, but the answer is because this newsletter, we called it Make It Make Sense, was not about website traffic. The goal for that was to build a really high quality newsletter that people were excited to sign up to and stay signed up to. And so the better experience was that inbox experience. And so that's an example of when you're really clear about what a product is supposed to do for you, it becomes really easy to make those sort of design decisions and trade-offs. Do we optimize for click-through? Do we make it possible for people to stay in the inbox? Do we make it possible for people to stay in the inbox?
Well, and that's kind of where I was going to go with the next question, which is, if somebody's out there in the audience and they're thinking about, okay, I'm going to start thinking about my newsletter or a spin-off newsletter or whatever as a product, and I know that it needs a goal. What's sort of the scope, or the realm of the possible goals out there that they could be thinking about? Is it just about revenue? Is it just about audience? What kinds of things can you think about that's sort of a legitimate goal for a news product?
Yeah, I think the goals probably fall into one of two buckets, either an audience goal or a revenue goal, and very often it's both. So one of the things that I think can be challenging to figure out with, for example, a newsletter is this newsletter is the goal of the newsletter to be the thing that drives people to the website, or is it that they come to the web, or are you trying to deepen the relationship there and sort of naming where in the funnel does this product sit? And so when you're thinking about audience goals, is this something about growing our audience? Is it about deepening that relationship, or is it about converting people? That's a really simplistic way to look at it. It's obviously quite a bit more complicated than that, but that's sort of, I think, the starting point for that conversation about audience goals. And very often, I think the newsroom needs to ask itself, well, where are we struggling the most? and which platforms are optimized for which part of the funnel, right? So, for example, the newsroom is really lagging on its membership goals. They might also be thinking about growing their newsletter list, because that is, up to date, the most effective way for growing membership, right? Email campaigns. So if you're struggling on the membership front, yes, you should be looking at optimizing your membership program, optimizing your messaging, but also how can you grow your membership opportunity by growing your newsletter list? If a newsroom is younger and struggling to sort of break through the noise and establish a place in the market, then they might be focused much more on top of funnel. And for that period of time, they might be focused much more on social and search and events and things like that that get them out in front of people. So sort of knowing what your P1 sort of organizational audience goal is helpful in those moments. And then revenue also comes into play, and which revenue stream you're going after with this product might influence that as well, right? So are you going after advertising? Going after advertising, then you're probably really focused on growing that newsletter list aggressively. But if the newsletter is most focused on membership revenue, then you might be less concerned about having a massive list and much more concerned about having an engaged list and having a feedback loop with people on the list. And these things aren't mutually exclusive, but it does all come down to trade-offs. And so being clear about which type of revenue is your biggest priority out of that product can help you decide the tone. How much of this is a newsletter for the in-crowd versus a newsletter for everybody? How much does it line up with the content on our website versus being sort of bonus content? I think like naming the revenue goals and naming the audience goals makes it a much easier to make all of these sort of micro decisions that you have to make when you're designing your product or trying to improve upon an existing product. And I'm using newsletters the most often because it's just like the easiest, I think, one to ground all of these sort of conversations in. But I think this applies to anything else that you're doing. It applies to SMS, it applies to events, it applies to cohesive sort of social efforts, campaigns, things like that.
Well, I think, and I like how this sort of dovetails with your number 3, which is the idea of writing a user story, coming with an avatar. Who is this for? Because once you kind of have a sense of those goals, then you probably need a picture of who this is for. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do think one of the things that can happen with a journalism organization is sometimes it's a little too prescriptive. Like the editor likes newsletters that go like this, or the editor likes, and so the question is, well, how does a customer respond? And do we have different potential readers or customers? And would they, benefit from different products? So talk about, writing that user story.
Yeah. So the user story, which there's a couple different sort of frameworks for them, but I think the most common one out there is a sort of fill in the blank sentence. When I'm doing X, I want to, you fill in a motivation there, and then so that I can, and you sort of add in their sort of expected or intended outcome. And writing a user story, it's just a really simple, really helpful focusing exercise. And I think what's great about it is that it is so simple that anyone can do one. I've even started teaching them to our reporters, so that when they sit down to maybe like write a guide for our audience members, they can be really clear about what the guide is supposed to help people do, which can help them make decisions about, oh my gosh, this thing is 3,000 words. I need to cut something. What do I cut? And it's like, well, what does the user story tell you is the biggest priority here? And what doesn't fit into that user story? What sort of feels extraneous to that? I write them for myself when I'm really stuck on how to proceed with something. And I think it really kind of gets back to that desirability factor. When we talk about the Venn diagram for innovation and desirability being one of those things, it's really easy to talk about audience needs at the beginning when you're sort of having the initial brainstorm sessions. But the deeper you get into designing a news product, editing the copy, designing visual assets, developing the promotional plan, figuring out the workflows, the further you can get from what you need to still be thinking about the most, which is what the person you're designing for wants. And so I think it's a little, it might be a little bit silly, but one of the things that I always do for myself when we're in those sessions is I have on my screen, and I often have at the top of the document, a brainstorm document, that user story that we are supposed to be keeping in mind as we do all of this, because it's not 600 words of exposition, but it does distill into something that you can sort of keep top of mind through all of those conversations and decisions and planning efforts. Who is this for? What is this supposed to do for them? And that way it's there when you're like looking at marketing copy and it's like not quite clicking. Or someone's like, let's add all these other features. And you're trying to decide whether any of them make sense. Like the core thing that you need to be thinking about as you make all those decisions is sort of sitting there right in front of you. And when I talk about sort of building with the user at the center through using a user story or a value proposition statement, there's a lot of different frameworks out there that all sort of have the same goal. I don't just mean this person clicks on housing story, so I'm going to serve them more housing content, but I'm going to put it in a newsletter format instead. That is a very content first way of thinking about things, even though you've packaged it up in a news product. So it feels like you're designing for a user, maybe like you've put a product packaging around it, but you still just put more content there and you've skipped that step of sort of why would somebody want this. You've really got to, newsrooms have to figure out how to think beyond just those observable behaviors, like what they click on or what they sign up for, and to try and get a little bit past that to understand what is driving those behaviors. And I think that gets lost in a lot of these conversations because we're always just so focused, and I think you just brought this up, we're always so focused on getting people to read or listen to what we make. That's what we're trying to do there. And we can very quickly forget that there needs to be a reason for people to want to do that. I am that person in meetings very often asking, but why would they do that? Why would they sign up for this newsletter that we made? Why would they listen to this podcast? Why would they make this part of their habit? There's a subset of people out there for whom being on the news, being up on the news is sort of a core part of their identity, but there aren't that many of them. And we can't build sustainable media organizations, especially at the local level, if we only design for that audience of people for whom being informed is like a part of their identity. It fulfills something deep within them to be that person that knows everything happening in the city that day. It is just too small an audience for us to be sustainable just by serving them.
Does this mean you come up with a user story like Sarah's a 42-year-old mother of two, and she's really worried about making sure that prices stay where they're supposed to be, or do you get that granular, or what does this look like in terms of these user stories?
It depends on the decision at hand, I would say, right? So if we're thinking about our voter guide, then it might be much broader. And if you think about sort of the user story framework, it's like when I receive my ballot in the mail, I want to feel like I understand everything I see on the ballot so that I can make the decisions that are best for me in my life in LA, right? So that's pretty broad because there's a lot of voters, and the voter guide is meant to sort of serve all of them. But for example, we did a guide to composting in California about 2 months ago, I guess. And we did a big citywide survey, before launching that guide. We heard from 500 people. I think that the sort of core question was, what questions do you have about the compost law in California? It's a very confusing law that got passed in last year. And there's so many questions. And out of that, we ended up writing a couple different user stories, and it was our way of distilling these like 500 responses into something actionable for the reporter. And there were a couple different ones. There was one of like, I want to know that I'm doing this right. That was one sort of motivation, is people knew that this was part of the solution to the climate emergency and they want to not screw it up. But there were also people who took it very seriously. They were like early adopters of composting, and they wanted to know, how do I make sure my neighbors are doing this right? And then there are other people who are like sort of skeptics of a lot of the solutions to the climate emergency that are bubbling up. And they wonder, like, how do I actually know that all this compost I'm doing is actually going where it's supposed to go? So those are different motivations. One is like skepticism. They want to be reassured that this is worthwhile. There's the people who are like the true believers who want to make sure that their neighbors are doing it right. They're already doing it right. They know that, but they want to make sure everybody is. And then there's the people who are confused and just want to do it right. And I bring that up because even within one story, even within one guide, we had to serve for 3 different kinds of users. And we had to decide what's the first user, like what's the priority here? Who do we serve first, second, sort of third, even in the ordering of the information.
I love it. All right. Those are 3 things. Ariel, thank you so much for doing this with us. I'm going to throw up your LinkedIn. People can follow you there and find out what you're up to, what you're publishing, where you're speaking. I know that you are a very busy person, and we appreciate your time today talking about news product. There's a lot of this kind of, I think, coming along. And for people who haven't heard much yet, I think there's a lot more for them to follow up with. Any resources, any last words that you'd like to toss out there?
I I think the thing I would like to leave folks with is how important it is to just get really clear about your biggest audience questions. Like we all know that feeling of sitting to look down at a metrics report and thinking like, what do I even do with this? But if you know what questions you need answered, the insights will start to emerge much more easily. When you have that clarity on those questions, you sort of start to see signals everywhere. You see them in the casual conversations you have about your product. You see them in the replies to your newsletter. You see that in the post-event survey feedback, but just like really knowing, what do I need to know about my audience members to succeed at my organization's goals? If you have that clarity on sort of what at any point in time, or your like top 2 to 3 questions, a lot of these things that we just talked about become a lot easier and a lot less daunting. So always taking the beat to ask yourself those questions ends up being really valuable. It ends up saving you time. It ends up making for stronger products. And I think it ends up helping with organizational alignment as well when you have to make a bunch of different sort of potentially competing decisions.